right. So Exodus 34. Let's we'll get into it in a minute, but there's three distinct sections in this chapter, and I just want to call this out before we read through it. There's the first section where God appears to Moses. Well, not quite. Like God shows his back to Moses, or like where he just was. It's kind of an odd thing. But then you have these almost like a new version of the Ten Commandments in some way, shape, or form, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. And then this interesting story about Moses with a glowing face. So I just want you to be prepared for like each of these stories. They're going to hit one right after the other. There's not going to be a whole lot of transition from one to the other. It's just going to, one ends and the other begins. So just know that that's coming as we read together this evening. We'll take the whole chapter in one fell swoop, and then we'll talk about each of those sections in turn. So I would like for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 readers. So there'll be several opportunities to read. I'm looking at verses 1 through 5. Can I have a reader for chapter 34, verses 1 through 5? Emily Clark, I saw your hand. Gloria D, I saw your hand next. Would you like to take 6 through 9? Yeah, okay, 6 through 9. Bunny, I see your hand. Would you like to take 10 through 16? Okay, Natalie, I see your hand. You all are prepaying before I tell you what you're going to read. That's risky. Natalie, I'd like for you to read 17 through, let's say 17 through 20, if that's all right with you. And then my next reader will do 21 through 26. Sarah Evans has that through 26. Okay, and then I'd like somebody to read 27 and 28. That's you, Kurt. Thank you. And then the final reader will read 29 through 35. Would somebody like to take that on? Bob Abbott, I saw you, 29 through 35. Okay. Let me make sure I've got all this written down, because otherwise I'm going to forget if we have 7. That's a lot of readers. All right, Emily, you're up first. Emily Clark, go ahead and let us know what translation you're reading from, and you've got verses 1 through 5.
Okay, so this time I've got a different Bible. It's the NIV Archaeological Study Bible, just for the fun of it. And the print is a lot smaller, so bear with me. The Lord said to Moses, "Chisel out 2 stone tablets like the first ones, and I will write on them the words that were on the first tablets, which you broke. Be ready in the morning and then come up to Mount Sinai. Present yourself to me there on top of the mountain. No one is to come with you or be seen anywhere on the mountain. Not even the flocks and herds may graze in front of the mountain." So Moses chiseled out 2 stone tablets like the first ones and went up Mount Sinai early in the morning as the Lord had commanded him, and he carried the 2 stone tablets in his hands. Then the Lord came down in a cloud and stood there with him and proclaimed his name, the Lord.
Thank you, Emily. If you notice some familiarity to that, it's because a lot of that was the same direction that was given right before Exodus 20. So just it's not deja vu. It's you really did read that a little bit ago. Gloria D, go ahead and let us know what translation you're reading from, verses 6 through 9, please.
NRSV 6. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped. And he said, if now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, I pray, let the Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance.
Thank you, Gloria. Well read. Bunny, you've got 10 through 16. Let us know what translation you're reading from, and then kick us off. Oh, you'll have to unmute first.
Sorry. The New English Bible. The Lord said, "Here and now I make a covenant. In full view of all your people, I will do such miracles as has never been performed in all the world or in any nation. All the surrounding people shall see the work of the Lord, for fearful is that which I will do for you. Observe all I command you this day. And I, for my part, will drive out before you the Amorites and the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Be careful not to make a covenant with the natives of the land against which you are going, or they will prove a snare in your midst. No, you shall demolish their altars, smash their sacred pillars, and cut down their sacred poles. You shall not prostrate yourselves to any other god. For the Lord's name is the jealous God, and a jealous God he is. Be careful not to make a covenant with the natives of the land, or when they go wantonly after their gods and sacrifice to them, you may be invited, any one of you, to partake of their sacrifices and marry your sons to their daughters. And when their daughters go wantonly after their gods, they may lead your sons astray too."
Thank you, Bunny. Well done. Natalie, you've got 17 through 20. Let us know what translation you're reading.
This is the New International Version. Do not make cast idols. Celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. For 7 days, eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you. Do this at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in that month you came out of Egypt. The first offspring of every womb belongs to me, including all the firstborn males of your livestock, whether from herd or flock. Redeem the firstborn donkey with a lamb. But if you do not redeem it, break its neck. Redeem all your firstborn sons. No one is to appear before me empty-handed.
Thank you, Natalie. Well read. Sarah Evans, you've got 21 through 26. Let us know what translation you're using.
I'm also using the NIV. 6 days you shall labor, but on the seventh day you shall rest. Even during the plowing season and harvest, you must rest. Celebrate the Feast of Weeks with the first fruits of the wheat harvest and the festival of ingathering at the turn of the year. 3 times a year, all your men are to appear before the sovereign Lord, the God of Israel. I will drive out nations before you and enlarge your territory, and no one will covet your land when you go up 3 times each year to appear before the Lord your God. Do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast, and do not let any of the sacrifice from the Passover festival remain until morning. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil to the house of the Lord your God. Do not cook a young goat in its mother's milk.
Thank you, Sarah. So again, you may notice that there's some overlap with what we've already read, particularly in the Book of the Covenant. That's, again, intentional. Okay, let's see. We've got Kurt. I think you've got 27 and 28. Go ahead and let us know what translation you're reading from.
I'm reading from the NRSV. The Lord said to Moses, "Write these words. In accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." He was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He neither ate bread nor drank water. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments.
Well read, Kurt. Well done. Bob, go ahead and finish us off, 29 through 35. Let us know what translation you're using.
I'm using NIV. When Moses came down from the Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him, but Moses called to them. So Aaron and all the leaders of the community came back to him, and he spoke to them. Afterward, all the Israelites came near him, and he gave them all the commands the Lord had given him on Mount Sinai. When Moses finished speaking to them, he put a veil over his face. But whenever he entered the Lord's presence to speak with him, he removed the veil until he came out. When he came out and told the Israelites what he had been commanded, they saw that his face was radiant. Then Moses would put the veil back over his face until he went in to speak with the Lord.
Thank you, Bob. All right, there's a lot to talk about here, and I am going to commit to you now. I'm looking at the clock. It's 8:11. You all have been so kind to me. Last week we went all the way to 9. I'm going to commit now that we're going to be done by 8:45, if not before. Okay. I make this commitment before you all. Hold me to it. So that means that I'm going to try and move us along, and I'm going to try to make sufficient time for each of these, but I'm also going to try and move us along. So if you've got something burning, please do stop me. But as we're moving, we're going to try and get out of here in a reasonable amount of time. Let's start with this self-revelation that God offers to Moses, this first chunk. And this is part of the compromise that Moses and God got to. You may remember in Exodus 33, where God is, the feeling that comes to mind is like God is sulking. And that's not quite what's going on, because it's not God who's sulking. It's the people of Israel that have rebelled against God, and God wants to, punish them according to what they've done. But Moses comes to God and appeals to God's goodness and God's covenant and God's faithfulness. And then he asks, "Let me see your glory." And this is in response to that request of Moses. This is what it means to behold God's glory. What struck you about this revelation from God? What struck you about this revelation of God's glory? Howdy, Gloria. We're in Exodus 34.
Exodus 34. Sorry.
No problem. Welcome.
Thank you. As we say in Spanish, she came just to say in time to say amen. Okay, I'm here.
So specifically right now, I asked the good folks here a question about the beginning of Exodus 34. I don't know how specific I was, but I'm looking particularly at verses 6 and 7. This God revealing who He is to Moses, and I'm curious about your thoughts. Sarah Evans, I saw you had unmuted. Do you want to offer something?
Well, you just said you were talking about, you're primarily looking at the other. What really struck me out of this, out of all the directions, is chisel out 2 stone tablets, because that was, God did that for Moses the first time around. You broke them, now you're going to have to make the new ones.
Right.
Moses didn't get off scot-free for getting mad either.
Right. Well, I think that's important to note, right? Because what Moses threw down in his anger was irreplaceable. These were stone tablets carved out by the very finger of God. And now Moses not only has to do the hard work, but, doesn't have these really cool God-made tablets. I saw Emily unmute, and then the Abbotts. Go ahead, Emily Clark.
So, as I said, I'm in this archaeological Bible, and apparently in the late Bronze Age, the Hittites also had stone tablets that had many similarities with the rituals down to the tent and the curtains that the Jews had. And it's illuminated in the Hittite text.
That's fascinating. I imagine that one of the ways that God met the Israelites is by coming to them in a way that they would culturally understand. But it's so neat to be able to see like concrete evidence of that. That God is not going to say, well, this is how I am worshipped at all times and in all places. No, God's going to manifest himself in some degree to a way that we can understand. Thank you for sharing that, Emily. Abbots, you were going to chime in with something.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting, that passage that says, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation. Well, I guess I only knew the three generations, my generation, my fathers and my grandfathers. I never even knew my great grandfathers. It seems to be kind of unfair to be punished for any sins he might have done.
Right. One of the ways that this always it makes it much easier to understand for me is to think of the damage that an alcoholic does on their family or a substance abuser does on their family.
Mhm.
And that takes several generations to work itself out. I think that God is smart enough to incorporate it into the natural way of things. Instead of extraordinarily being like, well, Bob, I'm going to smite you because your great granddaddy was an idiot in this way, or your great great granddaddy did this. So I think it does seem a little unfair. And at the same time, that God would keep steadfast love to the 1,000th generation seems a bit unfair, incredibly in the other direction too. So there's a tension that God's holding. Justice, mercy, and seeing that. I saw that Bunny had raised her hand, and I said, didn't want to steal your thunder, Bunny. I'm sorry if I did. And then Emily Clark jumped back in. Did you want to say something, Bunny? You good? Okay. Go ahead, Emily.
Well, I noticed that this time he generationally made people pay, but he didn't smite the whole herd of them like he did the first time.
Right. Yeah, that there's mercy here, that in spite of this people being a stiff-necked people. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Natalie.
Well, I noticed that we're continuing this whole thing of God keeps saying, he says, I'm making a covenant with you before your people.
Mm-hmm.
And Moses is saying, forgive us and take us as your inheritance. And Moses is continuing they're continuing to kind of have this argument of, God's ready to start over. He's got his guy and he's ready to start over. And Moses is really sticking to his guns about, these stiff-necked people, they're still worth keeping. And so Moses really loves them and is really fighting for them through all of this. And God keeps kind of pushing back. He's still mad.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, Natalie. That's really good. I think that this big argument that Moses and God had has now simmered and become sort of a Cold War, right? I don't know if you ever do this with people you love. I would never do this. People I love, where like there are things that are you and this other person disagree on, and so there are little things that are worked into the conversation sometimes, and this is a little bit, I think, of what God and Moses are doing, where Moses is really, like you said, holding his ground. Your people, God, you love them too, and working it in wherever he can. And God is being a little more reluctant to come around. And I think that this shows one of the results of sin. This is a part of how God balances this justice and mercy. We think of God as one who forgives and forgets. And I think that's true, but that doesn't mean that sin doesn't have consequences. There are injuries that sin does to our soul, to our relationship with God, that it's not instantaneously healed. It takes time to heal in spite of God's graciousness. So I think that this is a really good case study of that, where Moses and God are still kind of stretching each other. Mark, go ahead.
I'm struck by the term of God saying that he's slow to anger and rich in unfailing love and faithfulness. And the operative word there is unfailing. That God is God is God, so he's going to always be true and always be, there with his love and faithfulness.
Yeah, there's the Hebrew word that's there is one of the few Hebrew words that I've hung on to. It's a word that's hesed, and it means God's covenant loyalty, loving kindness. Like, it's such a rich and powerful word. It gets at God keeping his word and doing so generously and lavishly, unfailingly, as your translation says. And I think that's it's so important that that's one of God's characteristics, because regardless of what we do, that's who God is. Kate, I saw your hand raised. Then I saw Jim unmute. Go ahead, Kate.
First, could you write that word in the chat? I just would like to be able to see it and maybe write it down. And could you write it and define it in the chat?
Oh.
I want to write it down. That's an aside. I just wanted to build on what Mark was saying, because I think that we have a very individualized culture in America, where we read like sins are passed down third and fourth generations, and that makes us react, right? We're like, that's not fair. I'm my own person. But I think that what this passage is about is what Mark was saying. It's about God is steadfast forever, right? Like all of these terms that are about the depth, the length, the breadth of his love and kindness for us are all about eternal things that we cannot comprehend. And I think that you can see that in the comparison of the third and fourth generations that sin is passed down, compared to the thousands of generations that I'm missing the words that are used here. Let me see if I can find them. What is it that they use, Joel? What am I thinking of? For the thousands. Where is that even? I can't even find it.
Oh, that's
verse 7.
Thanks, Jim.
Right. So the steadfast love for thousands of generations in comparison with 3 to 4 for sin. So to me, what that's saying is one is minuscule and teeny tiny, and one is basically forever.
The way that I've heard it said, and I think I shared this with you before, is that the abyss of God's grace is deeper than the abyss of our sin. And that's comforting, because 250 times as big, right? At least. Go ahead, Jim.
I would just to follow up. I know we're running short on time, but I'm like everybody else. You're kind of concerned about this. The sins of the father follow you and follow you and follow you. But I'm wondering if that's just a way of God reminding the folks that they are a sinful people. That maybe they were beginning to get the big head that, okay, God's for us, they're knocking off everybody else. So here we are, we're perfect. And he's saying, no, you're not. And you are man is a sinful entity and will always be a sinful entity. But my grace and my love of you is 250 times or whatever the sin that you have. So I can kind of maybe rationalize that it's just telling us to don't get so full of ourselves at times.
I like that, Jim. Thank you. Sarah.
I just want to point out that when the disciples asked Jesus, what did this man's parents or grandparents do that he's suffering this? And he said, nothing. So we can, I think we can pretty much, consider that the next stone further on the pathway, that it's, yes, as Joel mentioned, something like, substance abuse or something like that can affect a family for generations. And I've seen that in my father's family. But at the same time, for ourselves individually, it's all on us and what God is going to use us for.
Thank you for bringing that up, Sarah. I think this is one of the difficult things about Scripture is you hear it saying one thing and then you hear it saying another, and trying to reconcile those things together is sometimes difficult. In this passage, it says that what you do is going to redound upon your kids, or what your parents did is going to have some effect on you. Later on, I think it's in Ezekiel, there's a proverb that some of Ezekiel's contemporaries were saying, the fathers and the mothers eat sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. You remember Pastor Josh preaching on that a few weeks ago, or maybe it was a couple months ago. It's sometime during the pandemic, is all I can it's the window I can narrow it down to. And so there's truth in both of these, right? That there is this idea of corporate judgment and corporate consequences, and there's also individual judgment and individual consequences. I cannot fault my parents for the way that my relationship with God looks. I need to own that. That's on me. However, I better darn well be sure that I do not be the kind of dad that makes Elizabeth have to accrue a ton of therapy bills when she grows up, right? Like, I think that it's that perspective that's helpful, because so frequently when we read that God visits the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation, we are so quick to put ourselves in the third and fourth generation, and we're not very quick to put ourselves as the parents. And I think that at this point, God is helping the people of Israel realize that what they do, the faith they have, is going to impact not only themselves, but their kids, not only their kids, but their grandkids. And this is for the whole community. So there's very much an individual responsibility, but there are implications of our faith that hit on other people in our community and other people that are in our family that we cannot avoid. So both of these things are very true. And I wanted I appreciate you calling attention to that, Sarah. I want to skip for the time being. Oh, Mark, I want to hear from you. And then I want to skip for the time being some of what I would call the 10 ritual commandments. We'll get back to these 10 ritual commandments. But I want to skip to Moses's shining face. I just think it's so important to make sure that as much as we can, we are good representatives of Jesus Christ for those in our community. So don't forget about that. Go ahead, Mark.
Two characteristics about the character of God. God says he's merciful and gracious. So we have these two terms, like mercy is a term you might think of in the Old Testament, and then we think of grace in the New Testament. And then the other comment I would make is that in verse 7, God says that he's forgiving every kind of sin and rebellion. So the concept of forgiveness comes into play here, which, in the Old Testament, the sin was covered, but it was never really forgiven. You could make your sacrifices, but God says, I'm a forgiving God, forgiving every kind of sin and rebellion. So, kind of getting to the character and nature of God.
Right. That this character and nature has always been there.
Yes.
Even before Jesus, God was looking for ways to forgive. And even if it was a temporary Band-Aid, right? I think that's good, Mark. Let's jump to verse 29 and beyond, and just touch on what's going on with Moses as he comes down from Sinai with this glowing face from having been in the presence of God.
Could I just say something?
Oh, please. Yeah, go for it, Mark.
Notice the background. This is the Michelangelo statue of Moses. And you can't really tell that this is in Rome. And if you look close on Moses's head, there's these two little horns. And the question is why are there horns on Moses' head? And it really gets down to a mistranslation of the Vulgate, which was the Latin version of the Bible, which when Moses came down, they said his face was corn. I think the term is cornuda, which is like for cornucopia, which you get the horns. Is sort of a mistranslation. So that's why, if you're interested in this type of thing, you probably can't see it very well in this picture, but if you're curious, look it up. So anyway, I'll just use that as by way of introduction, and I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mark. That's a good word. One of the things when I was reading a commentary on this, and one of the things that they were talking about is the idea of, well, could it have been horns? There's all sorts of speculation about, well, was Moses wearing some sort of mask that was like ritualistic, that he would go and meet with God? And this commentator was like, yeah, probably not. That's all a little much. And it makes a little more sense in reacting and in the context of this for Moses' face to be glowing, that there's something of God's glory that has been absorbed, infused into Moses, that there's something different about him because he was beholding God's glory.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gloria D.
Yes, I think I read somewhere on Michelangelo that there's supposed to be rays of light because he has gotten he has seen God, and then he has gotten these tablets. I think that Michelangelo is more positive. So that was one way.
Well, thank you, Gloria.
Incipient, rays.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you. I love seeing some of the history of translation and history of interpretation. It's really neat to see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's something profound about being in the presence of God and being changed by encountering God. And while we may not have glowing faces, there's gotta be something in us that when we spend time with God, we look different to people. Whether that's more of the fruits of the Spirit are being manifest by us: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, all of these. Whether it's that we have just a slightly different demeanor, whatever that is, when we come out from God's presence, we shouldn't be the same as when we entered it. Paul picks up on this actually in 2 Corinthians. He talks a little bit about how we are not like Moses. We come before God's presence, and instead of veiling our faces, I would need to actually get the source. It's like we are able to go around with God's glory manifest in us. We don't have to be ashamed of that, and we don't have to worry about it fading, which Paul suggests that it did with Moses. And so I think that there's something there to chew on that I haven't quite fully processed. But I'm wondering if you all have any thoughts on that before we briefly hit some of these alternative 10 commandments, as it were. Natalie, were you raising your hand?
Yeah, I just wonder if, was he covering his face with a veil because he was ashamed or embarrassed somehow, or was he doing that because he made the people around him so uncomfortable? And it was really for them so that they could kind of relax, because they were having a hard time dealing with, because it says his face was radiant and they were afraid to come near him until he called them over.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. And there's the tension of how much are we going to, with how we live, how much are we going to challenge people and how much are we going to comfort people? The way that Moses decided here was to veil, and that may well have been the right decision to care for his people. I saw the hobbies, and then I saw Bunny.
I just had the experience in my life where, in becoming friends with a couple women in college, there was something about them and their confidence and everything. And as our friendship grew and we could talk more deeply, it was their faith in God that was what was their inner core that made them have this confidence and this peace that that was lacking in myself. And so that's a way that I think we are changed by when we let God into our lives.
Right. Good. Thank you for that. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Go ahead, Bunny.
I've not seen it a whole lot in my life. The only person I can think of is there was a woman in our church who got baptized on Easter morning, and she chose to be baptized by immersion. And when she came up out of the water, the look on her face of I've never seen such joy on someone's face, the joy of the Lord. And it just made me realize that I hadn't quite gotten there, but it's a very dear memory to me to remember how it looked.
Thank you. That reminds me of the charge. I think I can't remember which church it is in the churches in Revelation, but there's a charge, I think, in Revelation 2. Do not forsake your first love. Go back to the excitement you had at first, right? And when we first found Jesus, our Christianity, many of us looked different than it does now. Just like, when you first find someone that you love, you express that love differently than you do after, however many years of marriage. And there are some things that are good about that, and some things where where is the joy of the Lord, right? Like we need to be what's the word that Twitter-pated. That's the word I'm looking for. Twitter-pated. What movie is that from? Is it Bambi? I saw. Okay, yeah. All right, let's hit up a few of these ritual commandments. This is the center part of our text today. I'm going to share my screen, and I've ordered these. I've tried to put them in the order that they appear. These are not as clear, I think, as the initial 10 commandments that we get. Hang on just a second. I'm sorry. Okay, great. Yeah, these are not quite as clear. I had to do some interpretation here in figuring out like where to split some of these, and I did. There are some of them that are pretty clear, like verse 17. You shall not make cast idols. Well, okay, that's probably a command, and that's probably different than you shall keep the festival of unleavened bread, which is the next verse. But even though like Protestants and Catholics and different types of Protestants have different ways of splitting the first 10 commandments, these 10 commandments is just like it's a scattershot, man. It's you can kind of get all over with these. And they're very different. Now, these don't rewrite the initial 10 commandments, but I think there's something really profound about these 10 commandments. They're future oriented. They look forward. They're not sort of like present oriented. They look forward to when the Israelites go into the promised land. And they're also practical. They acknowledge the sinfulness of the Israelites. There's this idea in here where you've got, okay, you're going to offer sacrifices appropriately. And while there were sacrificial instructions in the Book of the Covenant, to have this be a part of these like ritual commandments to establish the covenant, God is acknowledging, yeah, you're going to have to offer sacrifices. That's part of what it means to live as my people, is that you're going to screw up and you're going to ask for forgiveness. Some of you may notice that there's a couple of these that overlap exactly with some of the initial 10 commandments. Anybody see some precise overlaps here? You can just unmute and call them out. Go ahead, Sarah.
Rest.
Yeah, Gloria,
Rest
you said
on
rest.
Sabbath day.
Sabbath day.
Yeah.
Make no idols.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Those were the two that I noted, and there are a couple that are similar to some of the 10 commandments. Like, don't come to God with nothing is sort of like another way of saying don't steal, right? There are things that are rightfully God's. And removing the inhabitants of the promised land, the motivation given for that is so that they won't pursue other gods. So I want to just, go ahead, Sarah. I'm sorry.
I was going to say one that was identical that was really kind of off the wall out there is not cooking the goat in his mother's milk.
Right. Yeah, there's some that were exactly identical to the Book of the Covenant ones too.
There must have been a really big thing about that.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I put that as no mixing meat and dairy here. That's how kosher Jews interpret it now. Emily Clark, and then I want to share a video with you all before we end. Go ahead, Emily.
Okay, so I've got a really dumb question.
Please.
But in the Ark, do we have version 1.0 or 2.0 or both?
Yeah. So it depends on how you read it, right? I think that there's something. So I don't think that these 10 commandments override the previous ones. I think that these are the 10 commandments that sort of band-aid over some of the breaking of the covenant, and that help Israel to know God's not abandoned you. But Emily Hobby has something to say about this too, it looks like.
No, I have a question. I want to know if you could speak a little to the redeem your firstborn.
Yeah.
I can understand in talking about the animals with sacrifice and things like that. But what did it mean when it said to redeem the firstborn, when it meant the sons? Could you elaborate on that a little for me?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me finish what I was saying here to Emily Clark, and then yes, absolutely. I'll mention something about that. So my guess, and this is not coming from Scripture, this is just coming from my preference. My guess is that the original Exodus 20 10 Commandments are what was in the Ark, in part because those are repeated in Deuteronomy. And so that seems to be sort of the main event, whereas this is we're going to reconcile. As far as your question, Emily, this is part of remembering Passover, I think, where in the remembrance of the Passover, you remember that God went around and spared the firstborn children of the Hebrews, but slayed the firstborn children of the Egyptians. And so there's a redeeming the firstborn. There was a price that you paid, or like a tax that you paid, that would redeem the firstborn, as a way of saying this I owe this one to God, but God has allowed me to keep it, to keep this son, as long as I redeem him.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. Thank you for asking. Let me stop the share here. Go ahead, Sarah. And
I was just going to say, just before that, there was redeeming the firstborn donkey with a lamb. but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. And my thought is that there would be an offering of a sacrifice of an animal of some sort for the firstborn, particularly for the firstborn son, and that would be the redemption.
Yeah, I think that there was a practice of offering sacrifices for the firstborn, and I think that there was also, if I remember right, in Exodus 12 or 13, there was like a cash offering. Go ahead, Emily Clark.
Does that not refer back to Abraham and his son? Taking his son up to sacrifice to God and the lamb.
Yeah, it may. There are definitely echoes of that. I think that may all tie into sort of the larger foreshadowing of the Old Testament, where God works again within the stories of the people of God. And part of how God worked within it is that all of these things ended up pointing to Jesus, who is the firstborn, right? Who was our redemption. Jesus was himself redeemed and also was the full redemption for us. And so I think that the story of Abraham and this story are similar because they both point toward the same story, if that makes sense. But maybe you're right. Maybe there are some intentional echoes directly to Abraham. I confess it is now 8:46, and I still have a video. So I would not begrudge you if you leave. I promised 8:45. So if you need to be on your way, God bless you. Go in peace. And I can send the video for those who'd like to stay and watch it. This is a video that is mostly focused on Exodus 34.
We were a stiff-necked people.
Well, excuse me, Exodus 34, the beginning of it, 6 and 7. So let me share my screen with you and share my sound, and then we'll watch this together.
The Bible is a collection of many ancient Israelite scrolls, and together they're telling one unified story.
Now, if you look at the second scroll, Exodus, you'll find two important sentences. They're actually so important that they're referenced and re-quoted over 20 more times within the Bible itself.
It must be important. What does it say?
Yahweh, Yahweh, that's God's name, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness.
I can see why it's repeated so often. These attributes of God are really lovely.
And the statement goes on. He maintains loyal love for thousands, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he won't declare innocent the guilty. He will bring the iniquities of the fathers upon the children and grandchildren to the third and the fourth.
Okay, hold on. This last part takes a bit of a turn. We're first talking about God's love, and suddenly it's about his judgment on grandkids. So, is God merciful or vengeful?
Yeah, great question. Let's see these words in a larger context by looking at something important in Genesis, the first scroll of the Bible. There, God chooses one family, the Israelites, from among the nations, and he promises that he's going to rescue the whole world through this family somehow.
And Genesis ends with the family of Abraham in Egypt.
Then the book of Exodus begins, and this book has two large movements.
Right, okay, so this first movement of Exodus, God rescues Israel from slavery in Egypt.
And in the second movement, God leads them to Mount Sinai, where they camp out for a year. And God invites this whole nation into a partnership called a covenant, so that they can be shaped by his values and character.
And represent God to all the other nations.
Exactly. Now, this whole Mount Sinai movement in Exodus can be broken up into 4 literary units. First, there's the actual ceremony, where the Israelites agree to be God's partners. And God sets up the terms of the relationship, starting with the 10 commandments. The first 2 are,
don't give your allegiance to other gods, and don't make any idol images of God. Seems simple enough.
After that, God shows Moses detailed blueprints for building this sacred home so that God can come and live among them.
Oh, right, and then comes a really long narrative about the building of that sacred home.
But you missed something. Right in between these sections is the story that has our description about God's character. The story begins with Moses going up on the mountain, writing down the partner agreement, as the Israelites are at the base of the mountain, violating the first two commands.
That's ridiculous. They're breaking the covenant vows while the ceremony is still going on.
Yes. And so God is hurt and angry, and he warns Moses that this betrayal will keep on happening. God is ready to call it quits.
But what about his promise to rescue the world through them?
Yeah, exactly. This is what Moses brings up. And so, what is God going to do? Should he end the partnership, which would be fair?
Or will he be faithful to his promise to Abraham and show them mercy?
Yeah, exactly. Now, look back at the words that we began with, and you'll see they're about this very tension between God's mercy and his justice.
Okay, so the statement opens like this: a God compassionate and gracious.
In Hebrew, this line has three words that rhyme: El Rahum V'Chanun. And the line overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness matches the first, as it also has three Hebrew words: Rav Chesed V'Emet.
Each of those lines have two attributes of God, and they surround a fifth attribute, that God is slow to anger.
Right. Now, that's the first half of this description of God. Then comes the second half. God maintains loyal love for thousands. And how is he going to remain loyal to people who keep rebelling against him? By forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin.
But God's forgiveness doesn't mean people can just do whatever they want.
Right. God's mercy is balanced in what follows. Yet he won't declare innocent the guilty. He'll bring the iniquities of the fathers upon the children and grandchildren to the third and the fourth.
The third and the fourth what?
Well, it's referring to generations of people who repeat their ancestors' rebellion against God. They'll get what they deserve. But notice, this small number of generations contrasts that massive number up above.
God's loyal love to thousands.
Right. And then check this out. God's forgiveness of iniquity in this line is contrasted with his justice on iniquity in this line.
Okay, and all those lines are surrounding a central line here about God's justice. He will not declare innocent the guilty. So while God is slow to anger, he is also just.
Right. This is the tension that these two sentences are exploring. How does a faithful and loyal God deal with such a rebellious people? This is the challenge God faces in this story, and it's the same challenge he faces in the whole biblical story as he works to rescue the world through this family.
With that in mind, we can take a closer look at these 5 attributes that God declares about himself to Moses. A God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, overflowing with loyal love and faithfulness.
And we'll see how each one leads us deeper into the character of God and into the story of the Bible.
So the folks at the Bible Project are actually in the midst of going through each of those 5 adjectives of God. This video was published at the end of June during the summer. So they're kind of in the midst of exploring God's character. If you'd like to know the link that you can look at, they've got a couple of them out. I'll post it to the chat here, so you're welcome to take a look at it. A couple of logistical announcements before we end. Next week, I think it's going to be the last week that we'll be in Exodus. We have several chapters left, but they're all like exactly the same as chapters 25 through 31. It's just, here's what to do, Moses. And then this is, here's what Moses did. And it's all the same, which is good. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to follow what God commands. Because of that, we're not going to go through it with a fine-toothed comb. Next week, instead, what we're going to do is I want you all to come with some thoughts about the book of Exodus, some of the stuff that you've taken from the book of Exodus so far over the last, 6 months, really. We've been at this for 6 months. So if you bring some stuff that you've taken from that and be able to share one with one another, I think that would be good. And if you could also bring some thoughts about where you might want to go next. I'm planning on us meeting next week, having a break, and then jumping into another book of scripture if folks are up for it. So come ready next week with reflections, with if you want to move forward with another book and where you might want to explore if you move forward. Sound good? Any questions about that? Great. Okay, if you have questions about what we talked about tonight, I'll hang out for a little bit. Would somebody be kind enough to close us in prayer? Thank you, Bunny. Go ahead and unmute, and then you can close us in prayer.
Okay, there. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for being with us tonight. We thank you for the wisdom that you have shared with us, that we have learned the lesson that you planned for each of us to get tonight. Be with those who have any kind of needs. We ask that you meet their needs with your love and compassion. And guide us as we decide how to go forward. In your name we pray. Amen.